I am Bryce of the Cinder Archive, and this is Chapter 5, The Captain's Bargain. When last we left them, 5 strangers bound by nothing but a strange job and a stranger employer had gone, where they had no business going, into the dark, breathing heart of a sky, pirates' engine housing, hunting evidence of something Garrick Sterling wanted destroyed and never discussed. They found it, a thruster housing too warm to be simple brass, too smooth to be simple theft, with something in its seams that made Tamsin Vire say, without quite meaning to, that it felt like being looked at. And then, before any of them could decide what that meant, the ship found them in turn. A patrol's shout, a bell, ringing for blood, and a woman's voice above them in the dark, in no particular hurry, sounding for all the world like she'd been expecting company. This is not the chapter where they solve anything. This is the chapter where they fight, and where, if they are clever and lucky and willing to be a little bit ruthless about it, they learn that good sense beats brute strength at altitude. Mind the rigging tonight. It bites. The footsteps on the gantry stairs do not hurry, and that, more than the alarm bell still shuddering somewhere above their heads, is what makes Bram Coldyron's grip tighten on his haft. Hurrying men are afraid of you. Men who take their time are not, and Bram has spent enough years learning the difference that his body sorts the information before his mind finishes catching up to it. Weight shifting back onto his heels, breath slowing rather than quickening, the old familiar settling, and that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with readiness. Positions, he says, low, and doesn't have to say it twice. Senna sets her boots wide near the housing's iron rail, longsword low and ready, the ash-gray brand beneath her collarbone already a shade brighter than it should be at rest. Not yet spent, just listening, the way a held breath is still a kind of waiting. Wick melts backward into the shadow of a coolant pipe like he was born there, one hand already drifting toward the small tools at his belt, without any conscious decision on his part to put it there. Orsa's fingers find the haft of her sickle and do not let go, though her eyes are on the riveted ceiling, on the clothes, breathing dark of a machine the size of a building, with the specific unhappiness of a woman who has spent 50 years carefully avoiding rooms exactly like this one. There is no green here, no wind that hasn't already been bent through a pipe first, and some old, animal part of her keeps cataloging exits the way she'd catalog them in a den full of something that bites. Tamsin stays nearest the thruster housing itself, the warm one, the wrong one, because some instinct she hasn't examined too closely won't let her put her back to it. Not now, not with whatever's coming down those stairs. Lantern light spills first, swinging gold across rivets and pipe and the 5 of them in turn, and then boots, and then a woman who takes the last 3 steps without once looking down at them, the way a homeowner descends to deal with a draft rather than a threat. She's tall, weathered, somewhere on the better side of 40, in a long coat the color of old rust with goggles shoved up into hair that's given up pretending it isn't gray. 2 pistols ride her hips, well-oiled, well-used, the kind of sidearms that have clearly settled a great many more arguments than they've started. She surveys the 5 of them. Armed, illuminated, very obviously somewhere they have no business being, with an expression that isn't quite a smile and isn't quite anything else either. Well, she says, vermin in the engine room. In here I thought I'd had the hull checked twice this season. Captain, Bram says, it isn't a question. Captain Ressa Quill, of the good ship Brassfeather, at your service, or possibly at your considerable expense, depending entirely on how the next minute goes. She doesn't draw. Doesn't need to, not yet, and the not needing to is its own kind of statement. Her gaze moves down the line of them with unhurried professional interest, lingers a beat too long on Orsa's sickle with something that might almost be respect, flicks across Tamsin's choir-pale coat with mild surprise, settles last and longest on Senna's sword. Ashenvow, unless I've badly misjudged that brand on your collar, long way from home to be lurking in somebody's engine room, dear? We go where the work takes us, Senna says. Don't we all? Quill's smile sharpens, doesn't quite reach unkind. You'll forgive me if I don't introduce my companion just yet? He gets prickly about formal introductions before a deal's closed. The companion in question does not, on first inspection, look prickly. He looks bored, in the specific, weary way of a man interrupted in the middle of a sentence he'd been rather enjoying. A second set of footsteps follows hers down the stairs, unhurried in an entirely different register, the unhurried of someone who has never once in his life needed to run from anything and has stopped expecting to start. Lean, clean-coated, despite the engine grease coating everything else in the room, a ledger book tucked under one arm with the particular tenderness of a man who values that ledger considerably more than he values the next 60 seconds of his evening. There's a folding table set up behind him near the thruster housing, a lockbox, an inkwell, a half-finished receipt, and beside all of it, wrapped in oilcloth like something being smuggled out of a museum, the unmistakable curve of a second housing. Twin to the monster bolted into the Brassfeather's own hull. Just as warm, just as wrong, in all the same quiet ways that made Tamsin's skin crawl an hour ago. "You're early," the man says, to no one in particular, setting his ledger down with a small, irritated click. Then, properly taking in all 5 of them for the first time, or possibly very late, I confess I find it hard to decide which insults me more. "Who," Senna asks, "are you?" Disappointed, mostly, if we're naming the emotion and feeling most strongly right now. He doesn't reach for a weapon yet. He glances instead at the half-wrapped housing on the table, at the receipt he was apparently 3 signatures from finishing, and sighs, the specific sigh of a man already mourning a commission. I had a sale half closed. A genuinely good evening shaping up. Now I've got 5 armed strangers fondling my merchandise, and a captain who apparently can't be trusted to keep her own engine room locked. A glance, dry as ash, toward Quill. We will be discussing that, Ressa, once this is resolved. "Put it on my tab," Quill says, entirely unbothered. "Name," Wick says, from the shadows, in the easy, pricing tone of a man already cataloging the room's contents for resale value. "Or do we just go with the merchandise guys for the rest of the evening? Because I can work with that, but it's going to get clumsy fast. You can call me whatever speeds this along." The stitching inside his collar reads VOS, small and unassuming, and Wick clocks it instantly, filing the name away without bothering to announce that he's done so. The man's eyes drift to the housing, Tamsin standing too close to, then back to her face, and something in his expression recalculates, reprices her, the way a careful merchant reprices a buyer who's turned out to know more about the goods than the room's lighting suggested. Though I'd ask the young lady to step well back from my hardware before she does something we'll both spend the rest of the night regretting. "It's not yours," Tamsin says before she can stop herself, voice steadier than she feels. "Not built by you, I mean. I don't know what this is." "But I know enough metalwork to know your hands didn't shape it." A short laugh, genuine, surprisingly free of malice. "Sharp eyes, that one." "No, I don't build. Building's a young man's vanity, all that pride wrapped up in whose hands first shaped the brass. I refine. I deliver, on schedule, with discretion, to buyers who'd rather not ask too many questions about provenance." He spreads his hands, an honest tradesman's gesture, somehow more unsettling for how reasonable it sounds. A craftsman doesn't interrogate his clay. I don't interrogate my suppliers. You'd be amazed how many problems that single rule solves, simply by never letting the question get asked in the first place. "How does it cool itself?" Tamsin presses, before she can stop that either, the question pulling out of her with the particular helplessness of genuine professional curiosity overriding common sense in a hostage standoff. "I've never seen a thruster vent that ran that warm without scorching its own housing. What's the alloy?" Voss actually looks pleased by the question, the way a man does when somebody finally asks the thing he's been dying to brag about all night. "Proprietary," he says with real relish. Grown, rather than poured, near as I can tell, though I'll confess I've never asked precisely how. Sheds heat through the vents faster than any honest metal should, which is the entire reason it can fly the way it does. Buyers pay handsomely for that particular trick and don't ask the second question. You, I notice, already have. "Convenient philosophy," Bram says, before Tamsin can find a third question to ask. Profitable one. Funny how often those turn out to be the same philosophy in my line of work. He checks something on the abandoned receipt, actually checks it mid-standoff, which might be the single most unnerving thing he's done since arriving, and exhales the slow exhale of a man recalculating tonight's margins downward in real time. "So, here's where we are, and I'd rather we were both honest about it before anyone does anything regrettable. You're here for that?" A nod toward the housing, brisk, almost bureaucratic, or for something close enough to it, on behalf of somebody who'd very much like its existence to quietly disappear. "I have a buyer 2 signatures from closing on a matching unit, and I do not appreciate complications arriving armed and uninvited to interrupt my evening's commerce." "We could pay you to walk away from this deal instead," Senna offers, with the particular hopefulness of someone who has not yet learned that this rarely works on anyone worth worrying about. Funny. I was about to make the same offer in the other direction. Voss reaches into his coat, unhurried, and produces, not a weapon, not yet, a small, heavy purse which he sets on the table beside the receipt with the casual confidence of a man who has bought his way out of worse rooms than this one. 5 strangers, working for somebody who clearly doesn't want this conversation happening at all. I'll wager that somebody's paying you a flat fee, not a share. Walk away tonight, tell him you found nothing, and I'll make it worth considerably more than whatever flat fee you're working for. There is a beat. Short, almost nothing, gone before anyone else quite registers it happened, where Wick's eyes flick to that purse with an interest sharper than professional curiosity. It would be easy. It would, by any honest accounting of his life before this week, be exactly the kind of offer he'd have taken without a second thought a month ago. Tempting, he says aloud, mostly to watch Voss's face do something hopeful for half a second. But I think we'll pass. Pity, Voss says, and means it in the specific tone of a man who genuinely prefers bribery to violence on purely practical grounds. Less mess, fewer witnesses, better for repeat business. He pockets the purse again, unbothered, philosophical about the loss. Last chance, then, for someone to give me a reason not to treat the 5 of you as the single worst evening of inventory shrinkage I've suffered all year. You could just let us walk, Senna tries again, because some things are worth saying even when you already suspect the answer. He considers it, genuinely considers it, head tilted, one hand tapping once against the folding table, weighing the actual arithmetic of the thing, rather than performing consideration for effect. No, he decides, almost regretfully, I really don't think I could. And he reaches, without further preamble, for the harness strapped across his own back. Twin vented housings, smaller cousins of the monster bolted into the Brassfeather's hull, hissing awake with a sound like a kettle deciding, quite suddenly, to become a weapon instead. Ressa, mind the lockbox and the receipt both. I'll mind the rest. Captain Quill draws both pistols with the weary, practiced efficiency of a woman who has watched this exact negotiation collapse into exactly this kind of evening more times than she's bothered counting. For what it's worth, she says, almost conversationally, sighting down one barrel at Bram's center mass. I did tell him the showroom needed better locks before we ever opened for business tonight, and then the engine housing is full of noise, brass ringing, lantern glass shattering somewhere behind them, and there is no more time left for anyone's opinions about locks. The fight does not stay on the deck. It starts there, briefly, in a confusion of drawn steel and a first wild pistol shot that goes wide and buries itself in a coolant pipe with a hiss of escaping steam. And then Voss's thruster rig screams to full pressure, and he doesn't run for the door. He goes up through the housing's open maintenance hatch and out onto the Brassfeather's exterior catwalks, dragging the whole fight into open sky on purpose, and Bram understands why half a heartbeat too late to stop it. He wants altitude, he barks, already moving, already shoving Tamsin bodily toward the hatch ahead of him rather than waiting for her to catch up on her own. Don't let him get above us. High grounds the entire fight with that rig, and he knows it better than we do. The exterior of the Brassfeather is a forest of rigging and brass piping under a moon 2/3 full, catwalks strung between her gas bag's ribs like a spider's idea of architecture, and the wind-up here has firm opinions about anyone foolish enough to fight on it. Senna comes through the hatch first behind Bram, sword already in hand, and the cold hits her like an open hand across the face. Clean, thin air, the city's furnace, glow, nothing but a smear of distant orange on the horizon, and somewhere below all of it, an uncomfortable, dizzying amount of empty sky between the catwalk slats. Voss doesn't so much fight as move. Twin thruster bursts, kicking him from catwalk to rigging to gas bag strut, in short, controlled hops, never lingering anywhere long enough to be cornered properly. He carries a long-handled tool that's half boarding pike and half something considerably stranger, a vented lance that gouts steam-bright fire in short, vicious arcs whenever he chooses to stop dodging and start cutting in earnest. He's not aiming to kill us outright, Bram calls, ducking one such arc and feeling its heat pass close enough to singe the hair on his forearm. He's aiming to clear the catwalk and buy room to maneuver. Watch your footing more than you watch him. That's where this fight actually gets decided. Helpful, Wick mutters, flattening himself against a strut as a gout of fire chews through the rope a foot to his left and sends sparks scattering down into the dark below, and also a touch late, given the rope I was rather counting on. He recovers fast, though, faster than the moment should allow, already unspooling a weighted line from his belt with the easy, practiced motion of a man who has snared a great many things that didn't want catching. The next time Voss kicks off a thruster hop between struts, Wick's line snaps out low across the gap, taut and nearly invisible against the dark rigging, and for one beautiful suspended half-second it actually works. The line catches across Voss's ankle mid-jump, jerks him sideways off his intended arc, sends him cursing into an undignified scramble against a gas bag rib instead of the clean landing he'd planned. "That's mine," Wick says with frank satisfaction, already reeling the line back in for another try. "Don't get cocky," Bram warns. "He's recalculating." Watch the lance hand. Orsa, meanwhile, has gone very still in the lee of a brass stanchion, watching Voss's pattern with the patient, predatory focus of someone who spent 50 years learning how animals move, long before she ever learned to care how people did. "He favors the right thruster," she says, to no one and everyone at once. "Watch there." Every third burst, he leans harder into the right vent than the left. He's compensating for something. Could be an old injury. Could be the rig itself isn't balanced evenly between the two housings. "Or it's new," Tamsin says from a crouch near the hatch, eyes narrowed at the twin housings glowing dull orange on Voss's back as he hops another gap with a grunt of effort. "That's not a worn unit. Look at the burn pattern along the vents. That's fresh scoring, like he's only had it weeks, not years. He's still learning his own gear in real time. That's why the asymmetry. It's the kind of observation that would be merely interesting in a calmer setting. Here, with Voss's vent lance carving another smoking arc through the dark not 6 feet from her head, it's also the kind of observation that very nearly gets her killed, and would have if Bram hadn't already put himself bodily between her and the next burst. The flat, unhurried economy of a man who has done this exact thing, stand precisely where the fire is going, more times in his life than he's ever bothered to count aloud. "Eyes up, not down," he tells her, not unkindly, hauling her back a full step by the shoulder of her coat before she's even finished flinching. "You're no good to anyone with your skull cracked open on this catwalk." "Noted," Tamsin manages, breath short, and means it. But the observation's already done its work, lodged itself somewhere useful in the back of her mind, waiting. She doesn't wait long to use it. The next time Voss arcs close enough overhead for her to get a clean line of sight on the housing seams, she sketches a quick, economical shape in the air with 2 fingers, copper light tracing the gesture and vanishing into the dark above her. A disruption working, small and crude by the standards of a proper choir casting, meant to do nothing more than confuse the rig's ignition sequence for half a heartbeat. It catches. One of the twin vents stutters, fires late, throws Voss's next hop a foot shorter than he intended, and the copper scar along Tamsin's inner forearm flares warm and faintly bright beneath her sleeve in answer, a small private cost paid out in the dark where only she fully feels it. "Got him off rhythm," she calls, shaking the warmth out of her wrist like it's merely a cramp. "It won't hold long. He'll adjust." "Then we don't give him time to," Bram says. Senna, for her part, has found her own fight entirely. Quill, pistols barking, sure-footed on the swaying catwalk in the unmistakable way of a woman who's done this exact dance 100 times on this exact ship against 100 boarding parties considerably less polite than this one. A shot passes close enough to Senna's ear to ring it. She answers by closing the distance rather than opening it. Swordwork tight and economical, every strike aimed to disarm rather than to end anything permanently. "You don't fight like Hallstock," Quill notes, ducking under a blow that could have ended things rather more quickly than Senna seems willing to allow. "Most Val folk I've crossed paths with go straight for the kill and call it mercy afterward, once the body's already cooling." "I don't need to kill you to stop you," Senna says, "and there's something in the flatness of it. Not anger, just plain, settled fact, said once and meant entirely. That makes even Quill's grin falter for half a beat in the lantern light. That's the line I came up here tonight not to cross, whatever else happens between now and dawn. I'd rather you remembered that part of this, after. It costs her something to say it, mid-fight, breath thin from altitude and effort. Both, the brand below her collarbone glowing a shade brighter still with the strain of every blow she pulls just shy of fatal. But she says it anyway, because some things are worth saying precisely when nobody's required you to say them at all. Quill doesn't answer that directly. She fires instead, and the dance resumes, sword and pistol and catwalk groaning underfoot. And far across the gas bag's curved back, Voss laughs at something, maybe at Bram, maybe at the wind, maybe simply at the professional, uncomplicated joy of a fight still going more or less his way despite the inconveniences, and kicks off another thruster. Burst toward the highest catwalk on the ship, the one that overlooks the whole tangled battlefield below like a throne. He's going for the high ground in earnest this time, Bram calls, voice carrying flat and urgent over the wind. If he gets it clean, this turns into him picking us off one at a time from above, and we lose whatever edge we've got left. We end this before he reaches that top strut, or we very likely don't end it tonight at all. Working on it, Orsa says, in a tone that suggests, accurately, that she has already started. What she's working on, specifically, is the wind. It isn't flashy. Orsa von Trell has never once in 51 years done anything for the pleasure of looking impressive while she did it, and she doesn't start now, mid-fight, with a wounded man's escape route narrowing by the second. She simply turns her weathered face into the thin night air, murmurs 3 low words in a tongue older than the city glowing faintly orange beneath them, and pulls, the way you'd pull a stubborn taproot, patient and total and entirely without drama. The wind around the rigging answers the way wind answers people who have spent decades learning to ask it properly. It doesn't gust. It settles, cold and deliberate, precisely where she points it. Straight at Voss's thruster vents, mid-burst, while they're still glowing. There, Tamsin's voice cracks with the urgency of someone who's just understood something a half-second before it matters desperately. The vents. They're vented hot from all that burst firing. They have to be. That's how the housing sheds heat, or the whole rig cooks itself from the inside. Hit them cold now while they're still hot, and the metal won't know what to do with itself, Orsa finishes, grim and entirely satisfied in the same breath, and doesn't stop pulling for 1 second to admire her own reasoning. Frost crawls visibly up the brass housing on Voss's back, white and impossibly fast, a frozen river finding the path of least resistance across superheated metal that was never built, never grown, whatever the proper word for it should be, to survive a shock that sudden, that total. There's a sound like a kettle screaming, and then abruptly, violently, deciding against it, a mechanical groan, deep and entirely wrong, followed by silence where a heartbeat ago there'd been the steady, confident hiss of working thrusters. The vine pattern along Orsa's left forearm has crept another visible half-inch toward her wrist by the time she lets the working go, color bleeding out of old ink, like frost itself, finding a different kind of foothold. She doesn't mention it. She rarely does. Voss's next jump simply doesn't happen the way he intends it to. He's already airborne, already fully committed to the leap toward the high catwalk, when the right side vent seizes. Frost-locked, brittle, betrayed by its own residual heat the instant the cold hits it, and the whole rig lurches violently sideways, instead of carrying him up and over as planned. There's a long, horrible half-second where he hangs in the dark at entirely the wrong angle, arms windmilling, every line of his body screaming. This was not the plan. And then he comes down hard on the lower catwalk's edge, one knee buckling beneath him with an audible, ugly sound, the vent lance clattering away into the rigging below with a long diminishing clang that seems to take an unreasonably long time to finally stop. Now! Bram's already moving, closing the gap while Voss is still gathering himself off the deck, and for one shining suspended moment it genuinely looks like this might simply be over. 5 strangers, 1 well-executed tactical exploit, 1 businessman flat on his back with a frost-cracked rig and a buckled knee, and, by any reasonable accounting, nowhere left to run at all. It is not quite over. Voss comes up off the catwalk faster than a man his age, and a parrot temperament has any business moving, one hand already digging deep into his coat, and what comes out isn't a weapon at all. It's a fistful of something fine and metallic that glints and scatters wide the instant he throws it underhand. A spray of glittering powder that catches the lantern light and the cold moonlight both, and turns the air between him and Bram briefly, blindingly silver. "Don't!" Tamsin starts, a half-second too late, recognizing the stuff only after it's already airborne and doing exactly what it's meant to do. It isn't a weapon, not precisely. It's a distraction, alchemical and cheap, and exactly clever enough to work flawlessly on 5 people who have never fought as a unit before tonight. By the time the glitter clears properly from Bram's stinging eyes, Voss has already swung himself over the catwalk's edge on a line. None of them saw him rig in advance, dropping fast and controlled toward the dark below the Brassfeather's hull, toward, presumably, whatever smaller craft a sufficiently careful businessman keeps tethered for precisely this kind of contingency. "He's running!" Wick shouts, already sprinting hard for the rail, line already half unspooled again in his hand. "Let him!" Bram says, and the word surprises everyone there, including, faintly, himself, in the half-second before he's fully sure he means it. "We've got the captain!" "We've got the merchandise on that table." Chasing a wounded man into open sky in the dark is how you lose people off the side of a ship, not how you win fights you've already mostly won. It's the right call, and everyone there, even Wick, knows it before Bram's finished saying it aloud. But knowing it doesn't make it satisfying, watching Voss's silhouette drop away into shadow with his rig still smoking faintly, and one knee clearly, badly buckled, and still, somehow, getting away clean despite all of it. From somewhere below, faint with distance and wind, and the particular indifference of a man already cataloging tonight's losses, his voice carries up one last time, not triumphant, not even especially worried, more like a man already mentally drafting an apology he owes somebody else entirely, somebody considerably less forgiving than this rooftop full of strangers turned out to be. "Tell the collector," he calls, to absolutely no one positioned to do anything useful with the information. His shipment's compromised tonight. He's not going to enjoy that particular conversation any more than I'm enjoying this one. I can promise him that much for free. And then he's gone, dropped into dark and distance and the low, receding whine of a much smaller engine somewhere below, and the only people left on the high catwalk are 5 strangers breathing hard in the thin cold air, and one sky pirate captain who has finally, belatedly, stopped grinning at any of it. ASCII T, Quill goes down 5 minutes later, not because anyone manages to overpower her outright. Nobody quite manages that, not even close, not against a woman who clearly knows every plank of her own ship by feel, but because she runs out of ammunition, looks around at the smoking wreckage of her own engine housing and her business partner's hasty, undignified retreat, and makes the considered, entirely professional decision that the math no longer favors continued resistance. "Well," she says, lowering her spent pistols with something almost like relief, shoulders dropping a visible inch. "That's enough of that, I think, for one evening." She looks at Senna specifically, with an expression that's recalibrated itself somewhere between the fight's beginning and its end into something resembling actual respect. "You really weren't going to kill me, even with the shot that nearly took your ear off." "No," Senna agrees, already moving to bind her wrists with rope from her own belt, careful but entirely thorough about it. "I meant every part of what I said up there." Pity, in a way. Easier to hate someone properly when they lie about that part of it. Quill doesn't fight the binding at all. She watches the smoke clear over her own ship's railing instead, watches the city's distant glow flicker against low cloud, and seems, for just one unguarded moment, profoundly tired in a way that has nothing whatsoever to do with the fight just finished. He won't come back for me, you understand. Voss, or whatever name he's leasing this particular month. Men like that don't circle back for cargo that's already been repossessed by somebody else's strangers. "Is that what you are to him?" Orsa asks, not unkindly, crouching to check the binding herself with a craftsman's habitual thoroughness. "Cargo? I'm a customer who became a liability the moment 5 armed strangers showed up uninvited in my own engine room." Quill's smile is thin, rueful, entirely without self-pity attached to it. Wasn't personal? Not on his end. Just business, with men built like him. Was, anyway, right up until it became extremely personal for me about 10 minutes ago. Bram secures the rest of the scene while this particular conversation unfolds, checks the lower deck thoroughly, confirms the remainder of the crew has either fled into the rigging at the sight of their captain in irons or surrendered with both hands raised in considerably more enthusiasm than dignity, signals their own chartered ship to come alongside and take the Brassfeather properly in tow for the journey back. It's methodical, practiced work, the kind a man performs with his hands while his mind has already wandered somewhere else entirely, turning over the shape of a fight that went almost, but not quite, too smoothly to trust completely. On his way past the folding table, he flips open the ledger Voss left behind in his hurry to leave by the fast route. It's mundane in a way that's almost disappointing. Columns of dates, weights, prices, a man's careful accounting of a business. He clearly takes some private pride in running well, no different in spirit from any merchant's book in any market stall in Etherglen. The unfinished receipt sits on top, ink still wet at the edges, R. Quill, second unit, balance due on delivery, and beneath it, in a tighter, older hand, a column of names blotted out so thoroughly with fresh ink that not one letter survives the damage. Whatever else Voss is careless about, he isn't careless about that. He keeps good books, Bram says, mostly to himself, closing it again, for a man selling things that shouldn't exist. "Good books are how men like him don't get caught," Orsa says, not looking up from Quill's restraints. "Sloppy men get caught. Careful men get away with smoking knees and a head start." It's in the middle of all this careful, orderly business that Wick, with the specific, unhurried competence of a man who has done this exact thing in a dozen other engine rooms on a dozen other nights, and will likely do it again before the year's out, simply isn't where anyone last saw him standing for roughly 90 entirely uneventful seconds. He returns from checking the lower hold for stragglers, a task precisely no one asked him to perform, and which yields, by his own cheerful report, absolutely no stragglers whatsoever. with his expression arranged into a study of perfect, untroubled innocence and a coin purse that was not on his person an hour ago now sitting comfortably, satisfyingly heavier against his hip. He'd debated it for the length of exactly one held breath outside the captain's own quarters, weighing the small, private thrill of it against the rather larger question of whether this crew was the kind that noticed things. Decided, on balance, that the thrill was worth the risk, the way it nearly always is for him. Nobody notices. He fully intends to keep things that way for as long as it remains even remotely practical, which, knowing Wick rather better than he knows himself, will likely turn out to be considerably less long than he'd genuinely prefer. All clear below, he reports with the easy, sunny confidence of the entirely unsuspected. Good, Bram says, not looking up from the line he's busy securing. And if there's the faintest flicker of something amused and entirely unsurprised in the half-glance he spares Wick a moment later, he has the grace, or possibly just the good sense, not to mention it tonight. Senna allows herself, briefly, the luxury of laughing, a short, startled sound, mostly relief, as the adrenaline finally starts draining out of her in the cold air. "We're alive," she says, like she's only just confirming it to herself. "We actually did that." "Barely," Tamsin says, but she's smiling too, despite the lingering warmth still fading slow along her forearm. "I half expected one of us to fall off the ship at some point. Statistically." "Statistically," Orsa repeats, dry as old bark. "I think we did rather better than statistics had any right to expect from 5 people who met each other 4 days ago." Even Bram, tying off the last line, allows himself something that isn't quite a smile but stands respectably close to one. It's Tamsin who finds the mark, some 20 minutes later, while the others see to the captain and the wreckage and the slow, unglamorous business of getting 2 ships safely roped together at altitude for the long flight home. She's drawn back to the frost-cracked housing on instinct more than purpose, the one Voss was wearing, abandoned now where it fell when his rig finally ceased for good, brass split clean along one seam where the thermal shock won its short, violent argument with the metal. It's cooling slowly under her palms now, the unnatural warmth fading at last into something closer to ordinary cold brass, and that alone is almost a relief. Whatever this thing actually is, however wrong it felt to stand near an hour ago, it dies like normal metal eventually does, once you hurt it badly enough in the right place. That's when her fingers catch on the scratch. It's small. Deliberately small, tucked along the housing's inner seam where only someone running careful, trained hands over the whole surface, someone looking for exactly this kind of thing, the precise way a gear-right apprentice is drilled to look, would ever reasonably find it at all. A maker's mark, scored by hand rather than properly stamped by die, rough at the edges where a genuine mark would read clean and confident. A crown of teeth, gear-toothed, circling one single struck point at its center. Tamsin has seen Geary Sterling's actual mark exactly once before tonight, stamped clean and effortlessly confident into the housing of an old prototype frame tucked away in his workshop alcove. And this does not look anything like that mark, except that it looks exactly like it, in every single way that matters, and one specific way that doesn't. Geary's mark wears 6 teeth around its crown, struck so precisely it reads as pressed into the metal rather than carved by any human hand, a craftsman's signature as much as a flourish. This mark has 5. 5 teeth. Hand scratched, not stamped. Close enough that her stomach drops the instant her fingers trace the shape, recognizing it before her mind has fully caught up to why. Wrong enough, in that one deliberately missing tooth, that it could never, not for one moment, pass an actual gear-right examiner's eye as the genuine article. "Hey," she calls, and her voice comes out smaller than she means it to, swallowed almost immediately by the wind still moving through the rigging overhead. "Everyone, come look at this." "Please." They gather slowly in the lantern light. Bram first, wiping his hands on a rag as he comes, then Senna, still coiling the last of her rope, then Orsa and Wick trailing a few steps behind, drawn by something in the particular pitch of Tamsin's voice that none of them can quite name yet, but all of them recognize is worth hurrying for. The lantern catches the scratched mark at just the right angle, throws its missing tooth into sharp, undeniable shadow against the brass. "That's his mark," Senna says after a long moment, quiet, almost reverent in the way people get around things they don't yet understand the danger of. "Sterling's, isn't it?" "It's almost his mark," Tamsin corrects, and finds she can't quite stop staring at the gap where the 6th tooth should sit, where some hand that very definitely wasn't Geary's own chose, deliberately, carefully, not quite to copy him correctly. "Somebody made this look like his work. Close enough that anybody who didn't know to actually count the teeth would never think twice about questioning it, and just wrong enough that she doesn't finish the sentence. Nobody else finishes it for her either. Wrong enough that what? Wick prompts, when the silence has stretched a beat too long to be comfortable. That whoever scratched this wanted it almost right, Tamsin says finally, slowly, choosing each word like it might cost her something to get wrong. Not a forgery trying to pass. A forgery trying to be noticed as a forgery, by exactly the right person. I don't know why anyone would want that. But that's what this is. Bram takes the housing from her gently, turns it once under the lantern to see the mark for himself, and says nothing for a long moment. The particular nothing of a soldier who has learned, the hard way, that not every wrongness needs naming the instant you find it. We tell him, he says finally, handing it back. All of it. The mark, the missing tooth, the way it's scratched and not stamped. Sterling wanted evidence. He gets evidence. Whatever he decides to do with knowing somebody's playing dress-up in his own signature, that's his business to carry, not ours to guess at standing on a freezing catwalk at 2 a.m. Agreed, Senna says, though something in how quickly she says it suggests she's already turning the question over anyway, unable quite to leave it where Bram set it down. Orsa says nothing at all, which, from her, is its own kind of statement. Above them, the Brassfeather's ropes groan and settle as the two ships finish their slow business of tying together for tow, and far below, somewhere in the dark where a wounded man with a smoking rig and a buckled knee dropped out of sight 20 minutes ago, there is nothing left at all to see, only the ordinary, indifferent black of open sky at night, keeping its own quiet counsel about who, exactly, taught somebody else how to almost, but never quite, be Garrick Sterling.